When Diego Maradona arrived in Naples in the summer of 1984, he entered a city that already had its own arrangements. Arrangements that had little to do with football and everything to do with who held power, who collected debts, and who decided how things moved in the streets below. Maradona was 23 years old and the most famous footballer in the world, and within days of his arrival, people far outside the Napoli front office were paying close attention to him. Naples in 1984 was a city of roughly 1 million people packed into neighborhoods that climbed the hills above the bay and spread along a coastline that was, by any measure, one of the most visually striking in Europe. It was also a city with significant unemployment, a long-standing resentment toward the wealthier north of Italy, and a parallel economy that functioned alongside, and sometimes instead of, the official one. The Camorra, the organized criminal network rooted in the Campania region, had been embedded in the social fabric of Naples for generations. It was not a distant abstraction. It was present in the markets, the construction contracts, the supply chains, and the neighborhood hierarchies that ordinary residents navigated daily. Into this city came a footballer who within 48 hours of his presentation had attracted more than 70,000 people to the Stadio San Paolo simply to watch him be introduced. The crowd that day was not a standard football crowd. Families brought children. Elderly residents came who had not attended a match in years. People wept in the stands. In a city where Napoli had never won the Italian League Championship, where northern clubs like Juventus and Inter Milan had dominated the sport for decades, Maradona represented something that went well beyond his ability with a football. He represented the possibility that the South could win. His early weeks at the club moved quickly. Training sessions drew onlookers to the fences around the facility. When he drove through the city, people recognized the car and gathered at intersections. The sheer scale of the attention was unlike anything he had experienced even at Barcelona, where the expectations had been enormous, but the city had not rearranged itself around him the way Naples appeared to be doing. What Maradona was slower to understand, and what some of the people around him understood very well, was that in Naples, a figure of that magnitude did not remain only in the world he had arrived in. Fame in that city created gravity. It drew things toward it, including the attention of men who were not connected to football in any official sense, but who were very interested in being connected to Diego Maradona. Some of those men had already made inquiries. Not long after his arrival, arrangements would be made for Maradona to meet people who represented a different kind of power in Naples, the kind that did not appear in any club directory. He went. The meeting did not take place at a club facility or a hotel conference room. It happened at a private villa in the hills above Naples, in the kind of setting that suggested the host had no need to borrow anyone else's space to make an impression. Maradona arrived with a small group of people close to him, intermediaries who had arranged the evening and who understood, better than he did at the time, what kind of men they were going to see. The figures waiting for him were not politicians or businessmen in the conventional sense, though they occupied a space in Naples where those categories overlapped with others that were harder to name openly. They were men of standing in the city, men whose interests extended across neighborhoods, supply networks, and the kinds of informal agreements that kept certain parts of Naples functioning in ways that official institutions did not. They were connected to the Camorra not as low-level foot soldiers, but as figures operating closer to the upper structure of that world. What they offered Maradona that evening was not a transaction in any direct sense. There were no explicit demands, no contracts, no requests that would have been obvious to document. What they offered was attention, hospitality, and the unmistakable signal that he was recognized, not only as a footballer, but as a figure of genuine importance in the city. In Naples, that kind of recognition carried weight that Maradona, who had grown up in a poor neighborhood outside Buenos Aires, understood in a way that someone from a different background might not have. He was comfortable in rooms like that one. He had always moved easily between the formal world of professional football and the less structured environments of men who operated by their own rules. It was part of who he was, and the men at the villa almost certainly knew this when they arranged the evening. After that night, invitations of a similar kind continued to arrive. Private gatherings in homes that were not listed publicly. Appearances at social events where the guest list included men whose names were known in Naples but rarely appeared in print. Familiar faces began showing up in sections of the Stadio San Paolo that were not standard season ticket territory. None of this was hidden exactly, but it was not announced either. Napoli was winning matches, and the city was building towards something it had never experienced before. Maradona was at the center of it, and around that center a set of relationships was forming that football alone could not fully explain. The men who had introduced themselves that first evening were not finished with him. The proximity they had established was useful to them, and the social world that had opened around Maradona in Naples was one they intended to remain part of. What had begun as admiration was becoming something with more structure. And structure in Naples always came with expectations. By the mid-1980s, Napoli were no longer simply competing in Serie A. They were winning. The club had finished third in the Italian league in Maradona's first full season, a result that in any previous era of Napoli's history would have been considered remarkable. The supporters sensed that the years of watching northern clubs collect titles while the South watched from a distance were coming to an end. In the streets around the Stadio San Paolo and in the neighborhoods that spread across the city, the conversation about Napoli had changed register entirely. Maradona was the reason. Everyone in Naples understood this, including people whose interest in the club had previously been minimal. When a city begins to believe it is approaching something historic, the event draws people toward it, people who want to be present, to be connected, to have their proximity to the moment noted. In Naples, several of those people were the same men who had been appearing in the social world around Maradona since his first year at the club. Their presence at Napoli matches had become a regular feature of important games. They occupied seats or private areas where their attendance was visible to others in the stadium who knew how to read such things. After significant victories, gatherings were organized, celebrations that overlapped with the football world but were not contained by it. Maradona moved through these events as he moved through most things, with ease, without visible discomfort, and with the social fluency of someone who had never found it difficult to be the most prominent person in a room. But the nature of the relationships forming around him was shifting in ways that were harder to move through easily. An invitation accepted once becomes an expectation of attendance again. A favor received exists in a register that is rarely fully closed. In Naples, where the social economy operated through obligation and reciprocity as much as through money or formal agreement, the hospitality extended to Maradona over several years had created a set of connections that were not simply social in any neutral sense. The people around him, managers, intermediaries, companions from outside the club, were not a uniform group. Some had straightforward roles. Others moved between worlds that required more careful navigation. The distinction between a social acquaintance and a connection with consequences was not always made clear until it mattered. Napoli won their first Italian League championship in 1987. The city's response was unlike anything most of its residents had witnessed in their lifetimes. Maradona stood at the center of it, and the celebration that followed was enormous and prolonged and genuine. The men who had attended matches and organized gatherings and extended hospitality over the preceding 3 years were present for that celebration too. The same city that had given Maradona more than almost any other place in his life was also building, quietly around him, a set of complications that football could not resolve. Some of those complications were still years away from becoming fully visible. When Napoli won the Serie A title in May 1987, the city did not celebrate quietly. Fireworks went up across multiple neighborhoods simultaneously. Streets that would normally have emptied after midnight filled instead and stayed filled through the early hours of the morning. Banners appeared on buildings with Maradona's name and face, some of them hand-painted and hung from apartment windows overnight. The Stadio San Paolo, which seated over 80,000 people, had witnessed many matches in its history, but the scenes outside it that night belonged to a different category entirely. For the people of Naples, many of whom had grown up watching Juventus and Inter Milan and AC Milan share the Italian championship among themselves across decade after decade, the title was not simply a football result. It was confirmation of something they had been waiting a long time to feel. Maradona had delivered it, and in return the city offered him a quality of devotion that has few equivalents in the history of professional sport. He won a second Serie A title with Napoli in 1990. In between, he had led Argentina to the 1986 World Cup, scoring the 2 goals against England, one with his fist, one with his left foot, that would be discussed for the rest of the century. His standing in Naples during these years was not comparable to any ordinary athletic fame. Murals of him appeared on building walls across the city. Shrines were built in his name. Children were given his name at birth. He was not treated as a visitor who had come to help the club. He was treated as someone who belonged to the city itself. The men who had attended gatherings and extended hospitality and maintained their proximity to him throughout those years were still present during this period. The relationships that had formed quietly in private villas and late evenings in the mid-1980s had not dissolved when the trophies arrived. If anything, the trophies made the connection more visible. Being associated with the man who had given Naples its greatest football achievements was worth something that had nothing to do with sentiment. Investigators and journalists who later examined this period of Maradona's life in Naples described a social environment that was unusually difficult to navigate for anyone inside it. The devotion was genuine. The friendships were real in some cases. But the networks surrounding him were not neutral, and the expectations embedded in years of hospitality and access were not without consequences. Maradona left Naples in 1991 under circumstances that were complicated. A failed drug test, a suspension, a departure that the city experienced as both a loss and, for some, a rupture. He spoke about Naples for the rest of his life with something close to love. The city had lifted him to a height that few athletes in any sport have reached. It had also drawn him into a world that no football contract had prepared him for, and the distance between those two things in the end was not very large at all.